Today's video is brought to you by Bespoke Post. Bespoke Post is a monthly membership club delivering awesome boxes of top-shelf goods from under-the-radar brands. Every month, Bespoke Post introduces its members to cool new products, outdoor gear, barware, home and kitchen goods, clothing, and more, even live oysters based on a preference quiz that they fill out. It's free to join and you can skip a month anytime. They just sent me their copper box, which is so named because of these copper cups that come with it. These are really weighty, nice things. Chin chin. What you're going to do with these is make a Moscow Mule. Yes! You got this ginger syrup that goes along with it from something called Liber & Co. Fiery ginger syrup. This is a proper sized bottle. It's no joke. And you might be thinking, well, Simon, I need some crushed ice to go with my Moscow Mule. Well, no problem. I mean, they don't ship you the ice, but they do ship you a canvas bag, which you put the ice into, and then a mallet, which you smash it up with. The canvas absorbs the excess water, so your drink doesn't get watered down. Brilliant. I haven't actually used this yet, but I'm desperately looking forward to trying it when I get home from work today. Yes, every box has at least $70 in retail value, but costs just $45. The second box that I recently got was called the Fillet box, and it contained two amazing knives that I'm super enjoying. I just had like IKEA basic knives in my kitchen, and I've been enjoying the hell out of using some fancier kitchen knives. There is some B-roll of me using them at home playing right now. And you can preview each box before it ships out and decide whether you want to keep it, swap it, or skip the month for no charge. Bespoke's box lineup is also constantly changing each month, and it's great for you, but also as a gift too. Right now, you guys can get 20% off your first box by going to bspk.me/geographics20, or just click the link below and enter geographics20 at checkout. And now today's video. Hurricanes are unique among natural disasters in that their path of destruction can be predicted hours or days in advance. Unlike tornadoes or earthquakes, which give little to no warning where they will strike, meteorologists can watch the movement of a hurricane and predict fairly accurately what areas they're going to affect. But predictions can only do so much, and they can't account for failings in government, engineering, or disaster response by emergency officials. This is what happens in August 2005, when Hurricane Katrina almost destroyed the city of New Orleans and claimed over 1,500 lives. People could not understand how so many died when the weather services told everyone where the storm would hit and how bad it was going to be. The truth is, the stage for the disaster was set decades before Katrina was ever born, like a block tower with a shaky foundation that only needs a breath of wind to knock it over. Hurricane Katrina proved considerably more than a breath of wind, and Americans can only hope that the lessons it taught will prevent another disaster of its kind from ever happening again. New Orleans, Louisiana is one of the most interesting cities in the United States. Unlike the cities along the Atlantic coast, largely founded and populated by British settlers, or the ones in the West first settled by Spanish colonists, New Orleans was founded by the French in 1718, and during the colonial era, it trailed only Quebec as the most important settlement in France's North American possessions. New Orleans was sold to the United States along with the rest of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, and almost immediately became the most important city in the American South. New Orleans' French heritage can be seen today in the city's Creole and Cajun populations, descendants of French colonists before Louisiana became a part of the United States. New Orleans has a multilingual, multi-ethnic flavor to it, not seen anywhere else. It draws on West African, French, Spanish, Native American, and American Southern influences to create a culture not seen anywhere else. It is celebrated for its food, like gumbo and jambalaya, its unique architecture, especially in the French Quarter, its jazz music, which is played everywhere, including at funerals, and even for its dialect, with residents speaking in an accent that can only be described as pretty colourful. Perhaps what is most celebrated about New Orleans is its ability to party. The city has latched onto the traditional French holiday of Mardi Gras, the last day before the start of Lent, and made it its own. The celebration of Mardi Gras in New Orleans is wild, especially on Bourbon Street, where revelers can watch parades of colourfully dressed up characters tossing beheaded necklaces into the crowd, and indecent exposure is just a fact of life. Mardi Gras is worth over $1 billion to the city annually, making up 2% of its GDP. Another unique quirk about New Orleans lies in its geography. The city is sandwiched between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain, surrounded on three sides by water. As it expanded in the 20th century, land that had formerly been marshland was drained to provide more building space. This, combined with the fact that large parts of the city are slowly sinking, a process called subsidence, as water is drained out of the soil and the earth compacts, means that more than half of New Orleans actually lies below sea level. This has an effect on the city's architecture, as there are few basements in New Orleans and the city's cemeteries are filled with above-ground tombs instead of burial plots. To protect New Orleans from the obvious risk of flooding, the US Army Corps of Engineers, responsible for flood control in the United States, constructed a series of earthen embankments and concrete walls called levees that are supposed to hold back the water. Earthen levees and dam walls have been used for hundreds of years and are usually very strong as long as water doesn't compromise the internal structure, such as by flowing over the top of it or seeping into the sides. Among the largest and most destructive forces on planet Earth are tropical cyclones. These monster storms can be hundreds of miles in diameter, being visible from space. They form when low-pressure air from cooler parts of the planet blows over warm tropical seas, forming bands of thunderstorms. If enough of these storms form at the same time, they can come together into one huge storm that begins to rotate like a washing machine as it interacts with Earth's rotation. As long as the storm remains above warm ocean water, it can build in intensity with stronger and stronger wind speeds. These storms occur all over the world, though they are called different things depending on where they form. In the South Pacific and Indian Oceans, they are simply called cyclones. In the Northwest Pacific, they're known as typhoons. And in the Atlantic and Northwestern Pacific Oceans, they're called hurricanes. Along the eastern seaboards and Gulf coasts of the United States, hurricane season lasts from June to November and peaks in intensity in August and September. Multiple storms form out of the Atlantic Ocean and travel westward, sometimes petering out before reaching land, and sometimes making landfall either in the Caribbean islands, the coastline of the United States, or Mexico. The National Hurricane Center, which tracks these storms, has gotten very good at predicting what path each storm is going to take, so that they can warn the populations affected to prepare either by hunkering down or, in the case of severe hurricanes, to evacuate. As a result, though hurricanes strike with alarming frequency and do a lot of damage, there are relatively few deaths as a result of them, especially in the United States. 2005 was a busier than usual season for the National Hurricane Center, with the first storm forming in early June, and by the last week of August there had already been 10 storms large enough to be given names corresponding to letters of the alphabet, the first storm being named Arlene, the second Brett, and so on. On August the 23rd, a new storm system developed over the southeastern Bahamas. As it gained power, it was christened Katrina, and the NHC warned residents of southern Florida to brace for impact. On August the 25th, the storm became a Category 1 hurricane according to the Saffir-Simpson wind scale used to measure a tropical storm's intensity, and 2 hours later it made landfall in South Florida, causing $500 million in damage and killing 14 people. That might have been the end of it, except that instead of turning north and heading inland, the storm passed over Florida and entered the Gulf of Mexico. Now with a fresh supply of warm water to feed it, Katrina rapidly intensified, and meteorologists quickly realized that they had a monster on their hands. On the morning of August the 28th, Katrina became powerful enough to be classified as a Category 5 hurricane, the most severe rating a storm can have. It had a maximum recorded wind speed of 175 miles per hour, making it one of the most intense storms meteorologists had ever seen. At the same time, they realized that the storm was finally turning to the north, and the city of New Orleans was likely to suffer a direct hit. That morning, the National Weather Service issued a strongly worded bulletin that warned residents of New Orleans what they could expect from Katrina. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. At least one half of well-constructed homes will have roof and wall failure. All gabled roofs will fall, leaving those homes severely damaged or destroyed. The majority of industrial buildings will become non-functional. Partial to complete wall and roof failure is expected. All wood-framed, low-rising apartment buildings will be destroyed. destroyed. Concrete block low-rise apartments will sustain major damage, including some wall and roof failure. High-rise office and apartment buildings will sway dangerously, a few to the point of total collapse. All windows will be blown out. Airborne debris will be widespread and may include heavy items such as household appliances and even light vehicles. Sport utility vehicles and light trucks will be moved. The blown debris will create additional destruction. Persons, pets, and livestock exposed to the winds will face certain death if struck. Power outages will last for weeks as most power poles will be down and transformers destroyed. Water shortages will make human suffering incredible by modern standards. At the same time, the mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, ordered a mandatory evacuation of the city. Everyone needed to leave and head inland immediately. 8 other Louisiana parishes, as well as the coastal counties in the neighboring Mississippi and Alabama, followed suit. In total, over 1.2 million people were either asked or ordered to leave their homes. Between 80 and 90% of New Orleans' population complied with the order, and overnight, the once bustling city resembled a ghost town. But not everyone left. Many residents either refused or were unable to evacuate. Reasons why were varied. Some believed their homes were strong enough to withstand the storm and wanted to protect their property. Some feared being stuck in a long traffic jam when the storm hit, and many of the city's poorest residents simply lacked the means to leave. A dozen strong buildings all over the city were designated shelters of last resort for anyone still in New Orleans when the hurricane hit. The largest of these was the Louisiana Superdome, which had hosted 6 Super Bowls, but was now hosting over 20,000 evacuees. Hurricane Katrina made landfall the next day, August the 29th. Initially, it seemed like fortune had smiled on New Orleans because at the last minute the storm had weakened in intensity so that when it came ashore, it did so as a Category 3 hurricane. It had also shifted on its track so that the center of the storm, where the strongest, most destructive winds are located, made landfall to the east of the city instead of hitting it dead on. New Orleans hadn't escaped unscathed, with windows in high-rise buildings being blown out, an interstate causeway being jumbled up and broken by wind and waves, and the Superdome's roof being partially torn off, among other damages. But it was all manageable, something that New Orleans could easily recover from. And then disaster struck. Hurricanes bring more than destructive winds and heavy rain. They also bring a third, equally deadly force known as storm surge. The strong winds of the storm push ocean waves ashore with the force of a tsunami, forcing seawater ashore far beyond normal tidal limits. All of this excess water flows into the path of least resistance. This would be any rivers, canals, or lakes in the area, and it raises the water level dramatically. This is a phenomenon that is well known to meteorologists and civil engineers, and it is exactly what the flood control levees in New Orleans were designed to prevent. Which is why it was so shocking when, as the day wore on, the levees began to fail in dramatic fashion. There were over 50 reported breaches in the levees around New Orleans during the storm, including half a dozen major failures. And many of these failures were not caused by too much water simply flowing over the top of them either. The US Army Corps of Engineers had badly miscalculated the strength of the soil that they'd built the flood walls on, and they began to fail with the water level still feet below the point of overtopping the walls. Poor design, even poorer maintenance, and the hurricane all came together to wreck the entire flood control system, and billions of gallons of water poured into the city streets. Entire neighborhoods vanished from sight, covered by a sheen of ugly brown water that reached 10 to 15 feet deep in some places. 80% of the city was flooded, and so was the entirety of neighboring St. Bernard Parish. Some 200,000 homes and businesses were swamped. Residents who had not evacuated now faced a desperate fight for survival, retreating first to their attics and then to their roofs in an effort to escape the rising water. For many, help would not come for days as the authorities grappled with the sheer magnitude of the disaster, hampered by the failure of electrical power and a lack of manpower. It is believed that around a third of the New Orleans Police Department deserted the city before the storm, many of them taking off in their department-issued vehicles. This left the department critically understaffed. Not a lot of information was reaching the outside world as to what was happening in the city, as every broadcast network had been knocked out. The media filled in the blanks with a healthy dose of exaggerations and in some cases complete fabrications. The media painted a picture of a complete breakdown of law and order in New Orleans, with residents running wild in an orgy of looting, rape, burning and murder. There were reports of hundreds of dead bodies at the Superdome when, in fact, there were only 6. While there were isolated cases of looting and other criminal activity, it was nothing like the initial reports that the media were describing. Hurricane Katrina finally petered out on August the 31st, but not before it had wrecked a path of destruction that extended for hundreds of miles along the Gulf Coast. The drowning of New Orleans was the focal point of press coverage, but most of the rest of Louisiana, as well as Mississippi and Alabama, were hard hit as well. In financial terms, the total loss was eventually set at a staggering $125 billion, one of the costliest natural disasters in American history. But what set this disaster apart from most others in the United States was how deadly it was. Around 1,800 lives were lost. Around 1,500 of those were in New Orleans, where it took weeks to recover the bodies of all the victims claimed by the floodwaters. Americans were shocked and horrified. They were used to disasters of this scale happening in third world countries with poor infrastructure, not in the most powerful country on the planet. Shock turned to anger as reports began to surface how badly the civil authorities had bungled their response to the disaster. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is the government entity specifically designed to cope with disasters such as this. But 2 years previously, FEMA had been placed under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security, and there had already been criticism that the agency was now too focused on counter-terrorism preparedness to the detriment of natural disaster preparedness. FEMA's administrators seemed totally overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis in New Orleans, and they were slow to react. When they did react, it was in an overly bureaucratic manner that critics charged was more about ensuring they had complete control over every aspect of the response than the welfare of the victims stranded in New Orleans. Things got so bad that 8 days after the hurricane struck the city, FEMA director Michael Brown was replaced as the federal government's on-scene commander, and 3 days after that, he resigned his position in disgrace. But he was hardly the only one to face questions about the response to Katrina. There was plenty of blame to go around. Mayor Nagin was criticized for delaying the evacuation of New Orleans until 19 hours before the hurricane made landfall, trapping many people without a means of escape in the doomed city, and for directing people to emergency shelters that were inadequately stocked with food, water, medicine, blankets, and other supplies. The New Orleans Police Department investigated over 200 officers for deserting their posts during the storm, many of which were either fired or resigned. The department was heavily criticized for overreacting to reports of looting in the aftermath of the flooding, for spending more time policing petty crime than helping to rescue trapped victims. A month after the storm, Chief of Police Eddie Campus was pressured into resigning his post. The governor of Louisiana, Kathleen Blanco, was cited for being slow to mobilize the resources under her command. This included the National Guard, and both she and FEMA were criticized for seemingly spending too much time bickering with each other about jurisdiction than helping the needy. The failures at all levels were so numerous and so blatant that a congressional panel was put together to investigate it. Their report said, in short, that despite all the efforts made by the government since 9/11, the nation was still unprepared for a large-scale disaster like Hurricane Katrina had been. The failures of government agencies at all levels had hampered efforts by first responders to rescue people, and that if wholesale changes weren't made, it could very easily happen again. It took weeks for all of the water to either drain or be pumped out of the flooded sections of the city. By then, a considerable amount of water damage was done, and countless structures were condemned as uninhabitable. The storm had wreaked havoc on the city's infrastructure, knocking out roads, water and sewer lines and electrical grids. Over 800,000 people were displaced, and they needed to be housed, fed, and clothed. There were serious concerns that the damage was so extensive that the city itself might have to be abandoned, or at least great sections of it would be. Things only got worse in September when Hurricane Rita struck, and the hastily repaired levees broke again, flooding sections of the city that had already been damaged by Katrina. Help came from all over the country, from both government agencies and private non-profits such as the American Red Cross and Habitat for Humanity. They provided food, water, and clothing for survivors, and volunteers cleaned up debris and helped in the long, grueling process of gutting flood-damaged homes so they could be remodeled. Slowly but surely, reconstruction efforts proceeded with varying degrees of success. The damage to the Superdome was repaired, and the stadium hosted its 7th Super Bowl in 2013, while Six Flags New Orleans, a large amusement park that had been totally flooded, was eventually written off as being too costly to repair and was abandoned. Much debate was given over the fate of the many low-income housing units that had been damaged or destroyed by the storm. These were often the last to be worked on, assuming they were worked on at all. There were allegations that the civil authorities didn't care about the displaced poor residents of New Orleans, especially if they were people of color. By the end of 2006, most major businesses had reopened, the sports teams had returned, and the city had managed to put on a smaller but still raucous Mardi Gras celebration. But that didn't mean that the city had recovered. When the 2010 census was taken, it revealed that New Orleans had experienced a 30% drop in population from 10 years before, one of the most dramatic declines in the history of the US. Even today, the city has 100,000 fewer people than it did in the year 2000, a direct result of mass immigration stemming from the hurricane. Many people who were displaced and lost everything in the storm decided not to return or were unable to because of financial constraints. A lack of available housing led to an increase in rent costs, and many poor residents were unable to afford that. All over New Orleans, there are deserted buildings or vacant lots that were never redeveloped after the flood. The city has also faced political crises in the years since Katrina. In 2014, Nagin, the former mayor who had presided over the city during the storm, was convicted of accepting bribes while in office and sentenced to prison. He was the 17th New Orleans area politician to be convicted of corruption charges since the storm. The NOPD was also forced to let so many of its officers go for misconduct that it suffered a critical manpower shortage that still continues to this day. When you visit New Orleans today, you wouldn't know that the city had almost drowned a decade and a half ago by looking at it. The city relies more heavily than ever on tourism. When Mardi Gras celebrations were threatened by the COVID-19 pandemic this year, the city government worried about possible bankruptcy. But for anyone who lived in New Orleans in 2005, it is unlikely that they will ever forget Hurricane Katrina. Memorials and reminders litter the city, the most prominent of which is the New Orleans Katrina Memorial on the grounds of the historic Cypress Grove Cemetery. This solemn set of mausoleums is where the unidentified and unclaimed victims of the disaster are interred. The city still has a lot to offer a visitor. The French Quarter is just as vibrant as it's always been, and the food and the music are just as unique to the senses. Mardi Gras is still considered a must-see event, and the city's historic sites are largely still there to be enjoyed. What has changed are the people. New Orleans is less likely to take things for granted now, a little less blasé about things like safety, with a newfound respect for the awesome power of Mother Nature. Many people are still haunted by the disaster, still mourning friends lost, and some people believe the heart and soul of the old city was ripped out by Katrina, and that New Orleans will never be the same again. As the years go by and Hurricane Katrina fades into history, this attitude may change. Time heals all wounds, as the saying goes. One memory that shouldn't fade is the realization that even the most modern city is still vulnerable to the depredations of the natural world, and that the necessary precautions must be taken to mitigate this risk. Safety infrastructure must be properly built and maintained, a coherent disaster plan must be created and maintained, and cooperation between agencies at all levels must be achieved. Otherwise, it is only a matter of time before another disaster on this scale happens to an American city. And if you don't believe us, just ask New Orleans. So I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.